December 19th, 1944. The snow-covered forests of Belgium's Ardennes region lay silent under a pewter sky, the temperature hovering just below freezing. Somewhere in those dense woods, a young soldier from rural Mississippi gripped a length of heavy logging chain, never imagining that the improvised weapon in his frozen hands would become the centerpiece of one of the most extraordinary acts of resourcefulness in the European theater. He believed he understood what combat meant, what courage required, what survival demanded. He was about to discover he knew nothing at all. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would transform not just one young man's understanding of his own capabilities, but would challenge every assumption his commanders held about improvisation, determination, and the unpredictable nature of conflict. James Robert Williams had turned 16 exactly 3 weeks before he enlisted, lying about his age, with a borrowed birth certificate that claimed he was 18. The fifth son of a sharecropper family working land outside Greenwood, Mississippi, he had grown up with hands hardened by cotton picking and a back strengthened by hauling timber. His father, Samuel Williams, had worked the same plot of earth for 37 years, raising 7 children on determination and faith. Young James had watched his older brothers leave for the service one by one. Thomas in 1942, Marcus and David in early 1943, and finally Robert just 6 months before James himself walked into the recruiting station in Jackson. The recruiter, a staff sergeant named Patterson, who had seen 3 years of stateside duty and craved nothing more than a comfortable retirement, barely glanced at the birth certificate. The nation needed bodies, needed them desperately, and a strong farm boy who could handle himself stood out among the pale city boys who had never lifted anything heavier than a briefcase. James stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighed 173 pounds of lean muscle, and could work from sunup to sundown without complaint. Patterson signed the papers without a second thought. Basic training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, lasted 14 weeks. James excelled at physical conditioning. The obstacle courses and forced marches felt easier than a full day in the cotton fields under the August sun. What challenged him was everything else. He had completed only 6 years of formal schooling before full-time farm work became necessary. Reading came slowly, writing even slower. The technical manuals, the written examinations, the endless paperwork of military life created obstacles he had never anticipated. But he possessed something that could not be taught, an intuitive understanding of mechanical principles learned from years of jury-rigging broken farm equipment with whatever materials lay at hand. His training sergeant, a combat veteran named Morrison, who had survived the North African campaign before a shrapnel wound sent him stateside, noticed this quality. When a training rifle jammed during a field exercise, James disassembled it with fence wire and a rock, clearing the obstruction and reassembling the weapon in under 4 minutes. When a truck broke down during a night navigation exercise, James fashioned a temporary fan belt from bootlaces and electrical tape that held for 38 miles until they reached the motor pool. Morrison wrote in his evaluation report, "This soldier demonstrates exceptional mechanical aptitude and resourcefulness under pressure, recommended for infantry assignment where such qualities prove most valuable." James shipped out to Europe in late October 1944, part of a replacement battalion sent to reinforce units that had been fighting since the Normandy landings 5 months earlier. The crossing took 11 days aboard a transport vessel carrying 4,300 soldiers. He spent most of the voyage helping in the engine room, the only place on the ship where his farm boy skills commanded respect and where the color of his skin mattered less than his ability to keep machinery running. The chief engineer, a gruff career Navy man named Kowalski, taught him diesel engine maintenance during the Atlantic crossing, skills that would prove unexpectedly crucial. They landed at Le Havre on November 7th. The devastation shocked him. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble, the skeletal remains of buildings reaching toward grey skies, the acrid smell of destruction still hanging in the air months after the fighting had moved inland. The replacement depot processed them quickly, assigning soldiers to units based on an ever-shifting calculus of need and availability. James found himself attached to the 761st Tank Battalion, a segregated unit, equipped with medium armor that had been operating in support of various infantry divisions since August. The 761st had a complicated reputation. Officially designated a tank battalion, it more often found itself parceled out in small detachments, supporting infantry operations where armor could provide mobile firepower and psychological impact. The crews were all black soldiers, the officers a mixture of white West Point graduates and battlefield-promoted officers of both races. The unit had performed competently, if not spectacularly, through the autumn fighting, earning neither particular distinction nor particular criticism. Exactly the sort of middle-ground performance that kept segregated units from threatening the prevailing assumptions about combat capability. James arrived at the battalion's position near the Belgian border on November 23, Thanksgiving Day. The company he joined, Charlie Company, had just received 4 replacement tanks to bring them up to full strength of 17 vehicles. He was assigned as a driver for one of the new arrivals, a M4 Sherman medium tank that the crew had not yet bothered to name. The tank commander, Sergeant First Class Marcus Henderson, was a 31-year-old former railroad mechanic from Pittsburgh who ran his crew with quiet efficiency. The gunner, Corporal Thomas Reed, had worked as a precision machinist in Detroit before the service. The bow gunner, Private First Class David Coleman, came from a farming background similar to James's own, though from Georgia rather than Mississippi. The loader, Private Jerome Washington, was a 19-year-old from Chicago who had never seen a farm until basic training. Henderson gathered his new driver that first evening, sitting on the tank's rear deck while a cold rain began to fall. The sergeant spoke in measured tones, explaining how the crew functioned, what he expected, what James needed to learn. The Sherman weighed 33 tons fully loaded, powered by a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine that produced 400 horsepower. Maximum speed on roads reached 25 miles per hour, much less cross-country. The transmission had 5 forward gears and 1 reverse. Fuel capacity was 174 gallons, giving a range of approximately 120 miles on roads, significantly less in combat conditions. But Henderson spoke less about mechanical specifications and more about survival. The Sherman's armor, he explained, was adequate against small arms and shell fragments, but vulnerable to the German anti-tank weapons. The 75mm main gun could handle most threats, but struggled against the heavier German vehicles. Speed and maneuverability represented their best defense, keeping moving, using terrain, never presenting a stationary target. The crew's survival depended on each man doing his job perfectly, while trusting the others to do the same. James spent the following 3 weeks learning his trade. He practiced driving the Sherman across the Belgian countryside, learning to read terrain, to anticipate obstacles, to conserve fuel, to perform field maintenance. Coleman, the bow gunner who became his closest friend, rode beside him during these training runs, the 2 farm boys finding common ground in their shared background. They talked about home, about crops and livestock, and the particular challenges of coaxing life from difficult soil. Coleman had a wife back in Macon, a daughter he had never met who had been born while he was somewhere in England, preparing for the invasion. He carried 3 photographs wrapped in oilcloth, looking at them every evening before sleep. The rhythm of military life in a quiet sector established itself. Morning maintenance, checking track tension and oil levels and 100 other details. Afternoon training exercises, practicing fire and movement, coordination with infantry units, radio procedures, evening equipment care, cleaning weapons, restocking ammunition, writing letters home. The food was adequate, the accommodations better than expected. They billeted in a Belgian village where the civilians, grateful to be liberated, shared what little they had. James sent most of his pay home to Mississippi, keeping only enough for occasional cigarettes and writing paper. December brought colder weather and a change in atmosphere. Intelligence reports suggested unusual German activity across the lines, but higher headquarters assessed this as normal defensive preparations. The 761st remained in reserve, ready to support whatever operations developed but not expecting immediate action. The front had been relatively quiet here for weeks, and everyone assumed it would remain so through the winter. On the morning of December 16th, everything changed. The German offensive that history would call the Battle of the Bulge began at 5:30 a.m. with a massive artillery barrage that shattered the winter silence. Along an 85-mile front, more than 400,000 German soldiers supported by over 1,000 armored vehicles crashed into American positions held by approximately 80,000 men. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise, exploiting foggy weather that grounded Allied air support and concealed their approach. Within hours, the American front line had fractured in multiple locations. Units overrun or surrounded, communication networks shattered, carefully planned defensive positions rendered irrelevant by the speed and violence of the assault. The 761st received fragmentary orders throughout that chaotic first day. Move here, support this unit, prepare to counterattack there. The situation remained too fluid for coherent planning, each piece of information obsolete before it could be acted upon. By nightfall on December 16th, Henderson's crew sat in their unnamed Sherman at a crossroads 5 miles behind where the front line had been that morning, listening to confused radio traffic and watching refugees stream past, civilians fleeing the fighting, scattered American soldiers trying to find their units. The human debris of a collapsing front. The temperature that night dropped to 12 degrees above zero. They took turns on watch, 2 men awake while the others tried to sleep in the tank's cramped interior. James had the midnight to 2 shift with Coleman. They sat bundled in every piece of clothing they possessed, watching the road, occasionally sharing a thermos of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Coleman talked about his daughter, about his hopes for after the conflict, about the farm he wanted to buy in Georgia, where he could raise his family away from sharecropping's endless cycle. James mostly listened, having fewer dreams and less certainty about any future beyond tomorrow. At 4:17 a.m., on December 17th, new orders came through. The battalion would divide into 3 detachments, each supporting a different defensive position. Henderson's tank, along with 2 others from Charlie Company, would proceed to a village called Rochefort, where elements of an infantry regiment were attempting to establish a blocking position. The map coordinates placed it roughly 18 miles northeast of their current location, straight into the path of the German advance. They moved out at dawn, 3 Shermans in column formation on icy roads. The lead tank, commanded by Lieutenant Harold Foster, set a cautious pace, wary of German units that might have penetrated this far west already. The second tank, Sergeant Raymond Clark commanding, followed at a 100-yard interval. Henderson's tank came third, James at the controls, learning quickly how the Sherman handled on ice-slicked roads with a 33-ton weight demanding respect at every curve. They reached the outskirts of Rochefort at 9:43 a.m. The village appeared deserted, stone buildings silent and shuttered, no sign of the infantry unit they were supposed to support. Foster halted the column, radioing back to battalion for confirmation of orders. The response came crackling through static. The infantry regiment had been overrun during the night, survivors retreating west. The tanks were to withdraw immediately to new coordinates 15 miles southwest. Foster acknowledged the order and was turning his tank around when the first German shells arrived. The ambush had been perfectly positioned. German forces had occupied the village during the night, placing anti-tank weapons in concealed positions that covered every approach. The first round struck Foster's tank in the right track, immobilizing it instantly. The second round penetrated the turret, and the Sherman erupted in flames. The third and fourth rounds targeted Clark's tank, which had stopped when Foster did. One round missed, striking the road surface and sending ice and asphalt fragments spraying. The second round found its mark, punching through the Sherman's side armor. That tank did not burn but went silent, its crew likely incapacitated by the impact. Henderson reacted with the speed of instinct and 3 months of combat experience. He screamed at James to reverse, to get them out of the kill zone immediately. James slammed the transmission into reverse and floored the accelerator, the Continental engine roaring as the Sherman lurched backward. More rounds came, striking the road where they had been seconds before. James kept the tank moving backward at maximum speed, trusting Henderson to guide him, unable to see anything through his narrow periscope except the road behind them and the black smoke rising from Foster's burning vehicle. They made it 300 yards before the luck ran out. A round struck the Sherman's right track, severing it and sending the broken steel cable whipping across the road. The tank spun sideways from the impact and momentum, sliding on ice until it crashed into a drainage ditch, tilting at a steep angle. James was thrown against the controls, his head striking metal, stars exploding across his vision. He heard Henderson ordering everyone out, heard the panic in Washington's voice, felt Coleman pulling him toward the escape hatch. They tumbled out of the disabled tank into the ditch, into freezing water that came up to their knees. German machine gun fire immediately raked the area, rounds snapping overhead, ricocheting off the Sherman's armor. Henderson counted heads, all 5 present. Miraculously, no one seriously injured. But they were trapped in a ditch with a disabled tank, taking fire from at least 3 positions, with no support and no chance of the Sherman being recovered before German forces overran them. Henderson made the decision that saved their lives. They would abandon the tank and move west on foot, using the ditch for concealment, trying to reach American lines before the Germans consolidated their hold on this sector. Each man carried his personal weapon. James had an M1 carbine, along with whatever ammunition and equipment they could grab. Henderson took the radio, hoping to establish contact with friendly forces. Reed grabbed his gunner's bag, which contained maps and technical manuals. Washington stuffed his pockets with ration bars. Coleman took nothing except his photographs and his rifle. They moved through the ditch for approximately 1 mile, the freezing water sapping their strength, every sound suggesting German patrols closing in. The drainage ditch eventually ended at a culvert that passed under a road. Henderson called a halt, let them rest for 5 minutes while he studied the map with Reed. They were roughly 12 miles behind where the American lines had been yesterday, in terrain now certainly occupied by advancing German forces. Moving west meant crossing open ground with no guarantee of reaching friendly positions before darkness or German patrols found them. Their best chance, Henderson decided, was to find cover and hide until nightfall, then try to navigate west under darkness. The culvert itself offered temporary shelter, a concrete cylinder about 5 feet in diameter, running under the road for approximately 30 feet. They crawled inside, finding it dry and offering protection from both the wind and observation. Henderson set a watch rotation, while the others tried to warm themselves, wringing out wet clothes, sharing the few ration bars Washington had brought. Nobody spoke about Foster's crew or Clark's. Those thoughts remained private, each man processing the images of burning tanks and silent guns in his own way. James took the first watch, lying at the culvert's western end where he could observe the road and the open fields beyond. The landscape looked deceptively peaceful, rolling farmland covered in snow, scattered copses of trees, a church steeple visible perhaps 2 miles distant. But he could hear the conflict, a constant rumble like distant thunder, punctuated by sharper cracks that might have been tank cannons or artillery. Occasionally he saw movement on the road, German vehicles heading west, supply trucks and armored cars, and once a column of approximately 50 soldiers marching in formation. During his watch, James noticed something that others might have missed. About 200 yards west of the culvert, partially concealed by a small grove of trees, stood what appeared to be an abandoned logging operation. He could see the skeletal framework of a portable sawmill, stacks of cut timber, and various pieces of equipment scattered around the site. The operation had clearly been abandoned when the conflict reached this area, left behind in the civilian evacuation. What caught his attention was a large pile of logging chains, the heavy links used to drag felled trees from forest to mill. Even from this distance he could see the chains were substantial, each link perhaps 6 inches long and made of steel thick enough to handle multi-ton loads. When Henderson relieved him at noon, James mentioned the logging site. The sergeant studied it through binoculars, noting the chains but seeing no immediate tactical value. They were here to hide and survive, not to salvage equipment. Still, Henderson made note of the location on his map, the habit of a careful soldier who catalogued every potentially useful resource. The afternoon passed slowly. They rotated through watch positions, dozed fitfully, ate sparingly from their limited rations. The temperature outside remained below freezing, but the culvert provided enough shelter to prevent hypothermia. Radio communication proved impossible. Henderson's attempts to raise battalion or any friendly unit met only static. Either they were too far behind enemy lines for their portable radio's range, or the German offensive had so disrupted American communications that organized networks had ceased functioning in this sector. As darkness fell on December 17th, Henderson gathered the crew to discuss options. They could attempt to move west immediately, navigating by compass through what was now clearly German-occupied territory. The risk was substantial, moving at night through unknown terrain, possibly walking directly into German positions with no clear knowledge of where American lines currently stood. Alternatively, they could remain hidden here, conserving strength, waiting to see how the situation developed. This carried its own risks: discovery by German patrols, encirclement as German forces advanced further west, eventual starvation if they remained trapped too long. The discussion was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching from the east. They went silent, each man frozen in position. Through the gathering darkness, they watched a German column pass directly overhead: trucks, motorcycles, and what sounded like tracked vehicles, perhaps half-tracks or armored cars. The column took approximately 11 minutes to pass completely, suggesting a unit of considerable size moving west to exploit the breakthrough. After the column passed, Henderson made his decision. They would stay in the culvert through the night, rest and regain strength, then reassess in the morning. If German activity diminished, suggesting the front line had moved further west, they might attempt to navigate to American positions. If German presence intensified, they would continue hiding, waiting for an opportunity. The decision was not heroic, but it was practical. 5 exhausted men with limited ammunition stood no chance in a direct confrontation, and survival sometimes demanded patience over action. James took the final watch that night, from 3 a.m. until dawn. The temperature dropped to what he estimated was around 5 degrees above zero, cold enough that his breath froze on the scarf wrapped around his face. But the cold also brought clarity. The night sky cleared, revealing stars of astonishing brightness. And in the distance he could see the flashes of artillery fire, could track the conflict's progress by those angry orange pulses against the darkness. Sometime around 4:30 a.m., he heard voices speaking German, close enough that individual words were distinguishable, even though he understood none of them. He pressed himself against the culvert's concrete wall, carbine ready, hardly breathing. The voices remained stationary for perhaps 8 minutes. Soldiers taking a break, he thought, perhaps smoking or consulting a map. Then they moved on, continuing west, and he allowed himself to breathe again. Dawn on December 18th revealed a changed tactical situation. The road above the culvert now carried continuous traffic, German forces moving west in what appeared to be organized formations rather than the chaotic exploitation of breakthrough. This suggested they had consolidated their gains and were now advancing methodically, which meant American resistance ahead had stiffened enough to require coordinated rather than opportunistic movement. For Henderson's stranded crew, this was simultaneously encouraging and alarming. Encouraging because it suggested American lines still existed somewhere ahead, alarming because reaching those lines now meant penetrating through organized German positions. Henderson called the crew together for an assessment. Their situation had deteriorated. The radio remained useless. Their rations would last perhaps 2 more days on strict rationing. Ammunition was limited, and they were now clearly well behind organized German forces. Coleman had developed a concerning cough during the night. The hours in freezing water, followed by the culvert's dampness, had left him fighting what sounded like the beginning of bronchitis. Washington complained of numbness in his feet, early signs of frostbite from wet boots that had not dried properly. The discussion of options was brief because realistic choices had narrowed to one. They needed to reach American lines quickly before cold, hunger, and illness rendered them incapable of movement. Waiting was no longer viable. Henderson proposed they move west that night, traveling parallel to the road, but using whatever terrain offered concealment, hoping to either find a gap in German positions or at minimum get close enough to attempt crossing the lines under darkness. James had a different idea. During his watch, he had continued studying the logging site. The more he looked, the more he saw possibilities that a farm boy's eye recognized, but military training did not emphasize. Those logging chains represented tools, raw materials that could be adapted for purposes their manufacturers had never intended. On the farm, he had used similar chains to pull stumps, to haul broken equipment, to solve 1,000 problems where raw strength was needed and proper tools were unavailable. An idea had been forming in his mind, crazy and probably unworkable, but the kind of improvisation that desperate situations sometimes demanded. He explained his thinking to Henderson. The logging site sat about 200 yards from the road, in a small depression that offered partial concealment. If they could reach it without detection, they might find materials to fashion some kind of trap or obstacle for German vehicles using the road. A disabled truck would create confusion, possibly draw German attention away from their escape route to the west. At minimum, it might slow German advance marginally. At best, it could create enough chaos for 5 men to slip through the resulting confusion. Reed immediately objected, calling the idea suicidal. They were 5 men with light weapons, no support, no communication, proposing to harass a German army that had just shattered an American defensive front. Henderson listened to both sides, then studied the terrain through his binoculars. The logging site did offer some concealment. The road at that point had trees fairly close on both sides, limiting visibility. There was a curve approximately 300 yards east of the logging site where vehicles would naturally slow down. And Henderson was a tanker who understood the psychological impact of disabled vehicles on military columns. One burning truck could halt an entire convoy while officers investigated, secured the area, determined whether an ambush was in progress. The decision Henderson made demonstrated why he had survived 3 months of combat. He recognized that doing nothing guaranteed eventual capture or death from exposure, while action, even desperate action, at least offered a chance. They would move to the logging site, assess what materials were available, and determine if James's improvisation idea had any practical merit. If the situation looked hopeless, they would continue west as originally planned. But if opportunity presented itself, they would take it. They waited until full darkness on the 18th before moving. The 200 yards from culvert to logging site took 47 minutes to cross, moving in careful stages, freezing motionless whenever vehicle sounds suggested German forces on the road. They reached the equipment area without detection, finding it exactly as James had observed. A portable sawmill, stacks of lumber, various tools scattered about, and crucially, those heavy logging chains. James examined the chains by feel more than sight. Even starlight felt dangerously bright when stealth meant survival. The chains were exactly what he had hoped for, case-hardened steel, links approximately 5 inches long and 3/4 inch thick, designed to handle loads of several tons. Each chain section was roughly 40 feet long, with large hooks at both ends for securing around tree trunks or logs. He estimated there were 7 or 8 chain sections in the main pile, plus various shorter pieces scattered around the site. The other equipment proved equally useful. Coleman found a 2-man logging saw, its 6-foot blade still sharp despite weeks of exposure. Washington discovered a wooden toolbox containing various wrenches, hammers, and other hand tools that loggers used for equipment maintenance. Reed located several steel cables of the type used for tensioning saw blades, thinner than the logging chains but still substantial. Henderson found something that might prove crucial: 4 jerry cans of gasoline, probably left behind for the sawmill's engine, each containing approximately 5 gallons of fuel. James explained his plan more fully now that they could examine the actual materials. The road at the curve east of their position had substantial trees on both sides, with trunks approximately 18 to 24 inches in diameter. If they could position a logging chain across the road at approximately bumper height, secured to trees on both sides, a vehicle hitting that chain at speed would suffer significant damage. The chain was strong enough to handle tree trunk loads, meaning it could likely withstand and redirect the impact of a military vehicle traveling perhaps 20 or 30 miles per hour. The genius of the concept, Henderson realized, came from its simplicity. This was not sophisticated explosives or carefully planned ambush. It was basic physics and materials science applied with farm boy practicality. The chain would be nearly invisible at night, especially to drivers watching for armed resistance rather than primitive obstacles. A truck hitting that chain would either be stopped cold or have its front end torn apart, depending on speed and impact point. Either outcome would halt the column, create confusion, and most importantly, from their perspective, draw German attention to a specific point, while 5 American soldiers moved in the opposite direction. They spent the next 3 hours preparing. Coleman and Washington used the logging saw to partially cut through 2 tree trunks on opposite sides of the road at the curve, cutting enough to weaken the trees substantially, but leaving them standing. James and Reed positioned a logging chain, securing one end to the western tree trunk, at a height of approximately 3 feet above the road surface. They ran the chain across the road, keeping it slack and lying flat on the frozen asphalt, then secured the other end to the eastern tree trunk. The chain was heavy enough that its own weight kept it flat against the road, invisible in darkness. The crucial element was the trigger mechanism, and this showed James's mechanical intuition. They positioned a second, shorter chain vertically alongside each tree, attached to the main crossroad chain but currently hanging loose. When pulled, these vertical chains would topple the weakened trees. The western tree would fall east, the eastern tree would fall west. As the trees fell, they would pull the horizontal chain up from the road surface to that 3-foot height, precisely timed to meet whatever vehicle was passing at that moment. The falling trees would also block the road ahead and behind the impacted vehicle, trapping it and preventing easy extraction. Coleman suggested an addition. They positioned the jerry cans of gasoline along the road's shoulder, concealed in brush. If they needed to create more dramatic confusion, the gasoline could turn a disabled vehicle into a fire that would be visible for miles, absolutely guaranteed to halt the German column and draw attention while they escaped. Henderson set the trigger positions. Reed would handle the western tree, James the eastern. Coleman, despite his worsening cough, insisted on remaining as backup, positioned to help whoever needed it. Washington and Henderson would observe from the logging site, ready to ignite the gasoline if needed, and to provide covering fire if German forces responded more quickly than anticipated. They completed preparations at 2:17 a.m. on December 19th. Then they waited, watching the road, listening to the intermittent sounds of German vehicles passing. The temperature had dropped again. Henderson estimated somewhere near 0 degrees, and the cold became a tangible enemy, sapping strength, slowing reactions, making every movement painful. Coleman's cough had worsened. His breathing labored enough that Henderson worried the sound might give away their position. At 3:41 a.m., they heard it, the distinctive sound of multiple heavy vehicles approaching from the east, engines straining in low gear on the icy road. Through the darkness, they could see headlights. German columns had begun using lights again, confident enough in their tactical position to prioritize speed over concealment. Henderson counted at least 8 vehicles, possibly more. The column appeared to be supply trucks rather than combat vehicles, likely carrying ammunition or fuel to forward units, exploiting the breakthrough. Henderson gave the signal. James and Reed moved to their trigger positions, each man gripping his vertical chain, feeling the weight of the weakened trees above them, knowing that what happened in the next 90 seconds would either save them or doom them. James's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat, but his hands remained steady. The same hands that had handled chain and timber since childhood now applied those skills to war. The lead truck entered the curve, headlights sweeping across snow-covered fields. The driver was moving cautiously, appropriate for icy conditions, perhaps 15 miles per hour. James waited, counting seconds the way his father had taught him to estimate time when no clock was available. 1001, 1002, 1003. The truck's front wheels crossed the point where the chain lay flat on the road. 1004, 1005. The truck's center of mass reached the chain. Henderson's whistle signal cut the night. One sharp note. James pulled. Reed pulled. The physics of leverage and mass took over. The weakened trees, already stressed by the partial saw cuts, toppled as the chains jerked their trunks. The western tree fell east, the eastern tree fell west. As they fell, the main chain between them lifted from the road surface, rising through empty air precisely as the lead truck's hood reached that point in space. The truck hit the chain doing approximately 17 miles per hour. The chain caught the hood just below the windshield, the case-hardened steel links biting into sheet metal, with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. The truck's momentum carried it forward, even as the chain bit deep. The vehicle's weight and speed, fighting against the chain's tensile strength, and the leverage of 2 falling trees. For perhaps 2 seconds, the outcome hung uncertain. Then multiple things happened simultaneously. The chain held, but the truck's hood tore completely away, ripping backward over the cab. The driver, suddenly seeing a massive chain appearing from nowhere in his headlights, instinctively hit the brakes on ice. The truck slewed sideways, jackknifing as its wheels locked and slid. The falling trees crashed onto the road ahead and behind the truck, one of them clipping the vehicle's rear panel and spinning it further. The truck ended up perpendicular to the road, its hood gone, engine exposed and steaming in the freezing air, completely blocking the narrow road. The trucks behind began emergency braking, a catastrophic chain reaction on ice. The second truck slid into the first, hitting hard enough to drive both vehicles further sideways. The third truck veered right to avoid the collision, left the road, and nosed into a drainage ditch. The fourth truck managed to stop, but the fifth rear-ended it with a crash that could probably be heard a mile away. The remaining vehicles stopped in a confused tangle, headlights illuminating a scene of absolute chaos. German soldiers began piling out of the trucks, voices raised in confusion and alarm, trying to understand what had happened. Officers shouted orders. Someone began firing a machine gun wildly, apparently thinking they were under attack from the tree line. Return fire came from different Germans, soldiers shooting at shadows and each other in the confusion. Henderson and Washington splashed gasoline from the jerry cans onto the disabled lead truck, then ignited it with a simple road flare from the truck's own emergency kit. The fuel caught instantly, flames roaring up around the exposed engine, spreading to the wooden cargo bed, creating an inferno that turned night into flickering orange day for hundreds of yards in every direction. Then all 5 Americans ran. They moved west, through the trees parallel to the road, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the chaos they had created. Behind them, the burning truck created enough light to show the full extent of the disaster they had engineered. 7 German trucks disabled or damaged, approximately 80 soldiers milling in confusion, officers screaming contradictory orders, and 2 trees blocking the road so completely that clearing them would require hours of work with proper equipment. They covered approximately 3 miles before exhaustion forced them to stop. Dawn was breaking, revealing their condition. Coleman barely conscious. His breathing a labored wheeze that suggested pneumonia, more than simple bronchitis. Washington's feet were so numb he could barely walk. Reed had somehow injured his right arm during the chaos, possibly pulling a muscle or tendon on the trigger chain. Henderson's face showed the grey pallor of complete exhaustion. James was in the best condition, only because youth and farm-hardened endurance gave him reserves the others lacked. But they had succeeded. They had disabled a German supply column, created confusion far beyond their numbers, and most importantly, they had moved 3 miles closer to American lines, while German attention focused on the burning chaos behind them. Henderson estimated they were now perhaps 8 or 9 miles behind the current German forward positions, in an area where German presence might be thinner, focused more on logistics than combat operations. They found shelter in a partially collapsed barn, hidden enough for rest but offering escape routes if discovered. Henderson allowed them 4 hours of sleep, taking the watch himself despite his exhaustion. Coleman's condition worsened. His breathing had taken on a rattling quality that terrified James, reminding him of a younger brother who had died of pneumonia back in Mississippi. When they moved out again at midday on December 19th, Coleman could barely walk. Washington's feet had regained some feeling, but each step clearly caused agony. They made perhaps 1 mile in 3 hours, a pace so slow that Henderson knew they would never reach American lines before darkness, cold, or German patrols found them. Then James heard it. The sound of armored vehicles, multiple engines, moving slowly through the forest perhaps half a mile to their south. His first instinct was panic. German armor would be the end of them. But Henderson, using binoculars, identified them as American Shermans, at least 4 tanks moving in tactical formation, heading east rather than retreating west. American counterattack forces had reached this sector. Henderson used their last working flare to signal the tanks. Then they waited, hoping the tankers would investigate rather than simply continuing their mission. The waiting lasted 8 minutes that felt like hours. Then a single Sherman separated from the column, tracks clanking as it approached their position. The tank halted 50 yards away, turret traversing to cover them, machine gun aimed at the barn. A voice called out, demanding identification. Henderson stepped into view, hands raised, shouting their unit designation and circumstances. A tense negotiation followed. The tank commander wanted confirmation they were actually American soldiers, not German infiltrators trying to approach American armor. Henderson recited details that only an American tanker would know. The Continental engine's starting procedure, the specific radio frequencies used by the 761st, the name of the battalion commander. Finally, the tank approached close enough for visual identification. The commander, a lieutenant from an entirely different unit, accepted their story and agreed to evacuate them. Getting Coleman onto the tank required all their remaining strength. The bow gunner and loader had to climb down to help lift him onto the rear deck. Washington and Reed followed. James rode standing on the back, gripping whatever handholds he could find, finally allowing himself to believe they might survive. The lieutenant explained the situation during the ride to American lines. The German offensive had achieved dramatic initial success, creating a bulge in American lines up to 60 miles deep in places. But American reinforcements were arriving rapidly, and where the German advance had been stopped or slowed, counterattacks were beginning. This particular tank force had been tasked with retaking some of the ground lost in the first days, trying to cut German supply lines and relieve isolated American units still holding out in surrounded positions. When James mentioned the supply column they had disrupted, the lieutenant's interest sharpened. He radioed the information to higher headquarters. 7 trucks disabled, roadblocked, location precisely described. Within 30 minutes, they received confirmation that an artillery strike had hit the location, catching German engineers still trying to clear the road. The lieutenant looked at the 5 bedraggled soldiers with new respect. These were not just survivors, but men who had actively harassed German logistics, even while cut off and abandoned. They reached American lines at 4:30 p.m. on December 19th. A field hospital immediately took Coleman and Washington, both requiring urgent medical attention. Henderson, Reed, and James faced extensive debriefing. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about German positions, unit identifications, vehicle types, anything that might prove tactically useful. James found himself explaining the logging chain trap over and over, officers struggling to believe that 5 soldiers with no explosives or heavy weapons had disabled an entire supply column using nothing but improvised materials and farm boy ingenuity. The story spread through the units in that sector with the speed that remarkable tales always travel in combat. 5 tankers from a segregated unit stranded behind enemy lines, taking down a German convoy with logging chains. The details became embellished with each retelling. Some versions had James personally strangling German soldiers with the chain. Others had the crew destroying dozens of vehicles in an extended running battle. Henderson tried to correct the exaggerations, but the fundamental truth remained extraordinary enough. Coleman died 3 days later, on December 22nd. The pneumonia had progressed too far, his lungs too compromised, treatment delayed too long. Washington lost 3 toes to frostbite but survived. Reed recovered fully from his strained arm. Henderson received a battlefield commission to lieutenant, recognition of leadership under desperate circumstances, and James Robert Williams, 16-year-old farm boy who had lied about his age to serve, received the Bronze Star for valor and ingenuity in combat. The official citation read, "For resourcefulness and courage while operating behind enemy lines during the German offensive of December 1944. Private Williams demonstrated exceptional initiative in improvising obstacles that successfully disrupted enemy logistics and contributed to the defense effort. His actions reflect great credit upon himself and the military service, but the citation could not capture what those 72 hours had revealed. It could not describe the transformation of a scared teenager into a soldier who understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. It could not explain how farm boy skills learned in Mississippi cotton fields and timber forests translated directly to combat effectiveness when paired with desperate necessity. It could not measure the psychological impact on German logistics officers who, for the rest of the conflict, would approach every curve in the road, wondering if another impossible trap waited in the darkness. James completed his service, surviving the remainder of the European conflict and returning to Mississippi in late 1945. He never spoke much about the logging chain incident, finding the attention uncomfortable and the loss of Coleman a wound that never fully healed. He used his military benefits to complete his education, became a teacher in the segregated schools of the South, and spent 43 years teaching physics and mechanical principles to black students who faced the same limited opportunities he had known. In his classroom, he kept a length of logging chain, its links worn smooth by decades of handling. When students asked about it, he would explain the fundamental principles: leverage and force, tensile strength and impact dynamics, the way understanding basic physics could solve problems that seemed insurmountable. He never mentioned that these principles had once stopped a German army convoy, never told them that the chain in their classroom was from that Belgian logging site, retrieved years later, when he returned to the battlefield as a civilian pilgrim seeking closure. The official records of the Battle of the Bulge mention the 761st Tank Battalion in various contexts, noting its contributions to the defense and eventual counteroffensive. But the logging chain incident appears nowhere in those formal histories, lost among thousands of small actions and individual acts of courage that collectively stopped the German advance. Henderson's report was filed and forgotten, James's Bronze Star citation buried in archives that few would ever search. Yet the incident demonstrated truths that transcended its tactical impact. It showed that courage and ingenuity recognized no boundaries of race or education, that a 16-year-old farm boy could improvise solutions that confounded military professionals, that the most effective weapons are sometimes the simplest. It proved that segregated units, given opportunity and necessity, performed with the same resourcefulness and determination as any soldiers in the conflict. In the decades after the conflict, as the civil rights movement slowly dismantled legal segregation and historians began examining the contributions of black soldiers more carefully, researchers occasionally discovered references to the logging chain incident. Interviews with surviving veterans of other units revealed the story's persistence in oral tradition, always told with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Some military historians analyzed the tactical situation, concluding that while the impact on overall German logistics was minimal, the psychological effect, the uncertainty introduced into German planning by such unexpected harassment, contributed marginally to the defensive success. But such analysis missed the human dimension. For Coleman's daughter in Georgia, growing up without a father, the incident represented the moment when her father's sacrifice became meaningful rather than merely tragic. For Washington, living the rest of his life walking with a pronounced limp, it was proof that his lost toes had purchased something valuable. For Reed, it was a story to tell his grandchildren about overcoming impossible odds through teamwork and trust. For Henderson, it validated his decision to lead rather than simply survive, to take responsibility for other men's lives and honor that responsibility through action. And for James Robert Williams, it became the defining moment that shaped everything that followed. The teenager who had entered that Belgian forest, believing he understood what survival required, emerged understanding that he knew nothing at all, and that this recognition was itself a form of wisdom. He learned that desperation could spark innovation, that youth did not preclude capability, that the skills his father had taught him in Mississippi fields had value far beyond farming. He also learned the cost of combat, in a way no training could teach. Coleman's death haunted him for decades, appearing in dreams where he arrived at the field hospital just minutes earlier, where treatment began just hours sooner, where the outcome changed in impossible ways. Henderson understood this burden and, in their occasional correspondence after the conflict, never offered platitudes about acceptable losses or necessary sacrifices. Some weights, they both knew, could only be carried, never shed. The logging chain that hung in James's classroom became a teaching tool in ways he had not initially intended. Students would ask if it was really from the conflict, and he would confirm it was. They would ask if he had really used it to stop German trucks, and he would explain the physics of what happened while carefully omitting his own role. They would ask if he had been scared, and he would tell them the truth, terrified beyond description, yet functioning anyway because others depended on him, and because fear was simply another obstacle to be overcome like any other. In 1973, James received an invitation to speak at a military history conference examining the Battle of the Bulge. The organizers had discovered Henderson's after-action report and wanted James to describe the logging chain incident for the historical record. He declined, writing back that the story was not his alone to tell, that Coleman deserved equal recognition but was not alive to share it, and that he preferred to remember his friend privately rather than display those memories for academic interest. But he did write a detailed account for Coleman's daughter, explaining exactly what her father had contributed, how his courage and partnership had been essential, how he had died trying to reach American lines, not for himself but to help others survive. The letter ran to 14 pages, describing Coleman's character and competence, his dreams for his family, his final hours. James kept a copy of that letter, reading it occasionally when the memories became too heavy to carry alone. Henderson died in 1989, having never spoken publicly about the incident despite receiving numerous requests from military historians and journalists. His obituary mentioned his Bronze Star and Battlefield Commission, but provided no details about how they were earned. James attended the funeral in Pittsburgh, one of 3 surviving members of that Sherman crew who made the journey. They stood together in the cold March rain, 3 old men remembering 5 young soldiers in a Belgian forest, and they did not speak of logging chains or burning trucks or heroic actions. They spoke instead of Coleman's laugh, of Reed's quiet competence, of Henderson's steady leadership, of being young and terrified and somehow surviving. The military eventually recognized the contributions of segregated units more formally. In 1996, a monument was dedicated honoring the service of the 761st Tank Battalion, listing the various actions in which it participated. James attended that ceremony as well, now 70 years old, walking with a cane but standing straight when the colors were presented. A young officer asked if he had any memories to share with the assembled crowd. James declined, saying only that he had been privileged to serve with good men who deserved to be remembered. But that evening, after the ceremony, he gathered with the few surviving veterans of Charlie Company. They traded memories and shared photographs, piecing together the fragments of shared history that official records could never capture. Someone mentioned the logging chain incident, and the stories came flooding back, each man remembering different details, arguing good-naturedly about sequence and timing and who did what. James listened more than he spoke, content to let others tell the tale, adding occasional corrections when memory strayed too far from truth. What emerged from that conversation was a consensus about what the incident had meant. It was not about heroism in any conventional sense. They had not defeated a major German force or changed the conflict's trajectory. It was not about tactical brilliance. The chain trap was crude, relying more on luck than planning. Rather, it was about maintaining human dignity and agency in circumstances designed to strip away both. 5 men, abandoned behind enemy lines, refusing to surrender to despair or paralysis, choosing action over resignation. The logging chain was simply a tool, no more significant than the saw or the gasoline or the trees. What mattered was the decision to use available materials creatively rather than accepting doom passively. James Williams died in 2007 at age 79, having outlived all other members of that Sherman crew. His funeral was well attended by former students, who remembered an excellent teacher and a man who had demanded their best while never accepting limitations others imposed on them. The eulogy mentioned his military service, but focused primarily on his educational career and community contributions. The logging chain from his classroom was buried with him at his request, though few mourners understood its significance. Among his effects, his family found extensive journals documenting his experiences during the conflict and his thoughts about them over subsequent decades. The journals revealed a man who had struggled with survivor's guilt, who questioned why he had lived when Coleman died, who wondered if the logging chain incident had achieved anything meaningful, or merely delayed inevitable German movements by a few hours. But the journals also showed how he had gradually made peace with those questions, accepting that some mysteries had no answers, and that meaning was often found not in grand gestures, but in small acts of everyday courage. His daughter donated the journals to a military archive, where they became part of the permanent collection documenting the experiences of black soldiers in World War II. Historians who read them found in James's words a perspective rarely captured in official records, the view from the bottom, from the youngest and least experienced soldier, from someone whose contribution could easily have vanished unrecorded. His detailed description of the logging chain incident provided information that Henderson's tactical report had omitted: the fear and doubt, the physical sensation of pulling that chain and feeling trees topple, the moral complexity of creating destruction, even in service of survival. The incident's legacy extended beyond individual memory into tactical doctrine. Military engineers studying improvised obstacles during the late 20th century examined various historical examples, including the logging chain trap. Analysis concluded that the concept, while crude, demonstrated principles that remained valid, using terrain features as structural support, exploiting enemy predictability, creating psychological impact disproportionate to physical damage. Some of these principles informed later training in asymmetric tactics and improvised defensive measures. But perhaps the most important legacy was one that could not be quantified or taught. The story of 5 soldiers using logging chains to harass a German army convoy became, in the telling and retelling, a parable about resourcefulness overcoming disadvantage, about courage manifesting in unexpected forms, about human ingenuity triumphing over material superiority. It reminded generations of soldiers that victory came not always to the best equipped, but often to the most adaptable, not necessarily to the strongest, but frequently to the most determined. The farm boy from Mississippi, who became that soldier, learned this truth in 72 hours of desperate improvisation behind enemy lines. He carried that knowledge through 4 decades of teaching, passing it to students who would face their own battles against racism, poverty, and limited opportunity. And when he died, he took with him memories that no official history could capture, but that shaped lives far beyond that Belgian forest, where a teenager once pulled a chain and discovered what he was capable of becoming. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.